Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the MarkeTech Group's webinar, Pricing 101, a primer for pricing research. So I'm Robert Enzerink. I'm a partner and a senior consultant with the MarkeTech Group. We're specialists in medical... What's wrong?
You have to start over. You got to change presenter to you because it's showing a movie.
Right. Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the MarkeTech Group's webinar, Pricing 101, a primer for pricing research. I'm Robert Enzerink. I'm a partner and senior consultant with the MarkeTech Group. We're specialists in medical technology, marketing research, and strategy consulting. The MarkeTech Group provides these webinars to share our experiences that we've learned in the hope that some of the marketing research techniques we share can be useful for you to develop your business. In this case, we'll share with you part one of this two-part series on pricing research, considerations to guide your pricing decision making. Now, a few of you have submitted questions to the MarkeTech Group prior to today's webinar, and we've incorporated these into the discussion where possible. If you have questions during the webinar, I encourage you to text questions into the GoToWebinar question box that should be up on your screen, and we will address as many of your questions as we can during today's discussion. If we can't address them during the discussion, we'll do our best to answer you personally, either via email or a phone call, and answer your question individually. With respect for everyone's time, let's get started. So today, our Pricing 101, we're going to talk about some general considerations when designing a pricing study. And we'll talk about two particular declarative techniques, Cascading Price and Funstendorp, the Funstendorp price sensitivity meter. And then in early September, mark your calendars for September 10th, we'll offer our Pricing 201, where we'll talk about some more in-depth and sophisticated techniques that include preference modeling and conjoint, as well as market modeling. And I'll reference that later on in our conversation today. So in the next 30 to 45 minutes, you'll learn some methodologies to extract willingness to pay, some of the advantages and disadvantages of various pricing methodologies, as well as selecting a technique to meet your specific objectives. And we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of some of the different techniques in terms of their ability to meet your objectives. And then we'll provide an overview of pricing for fixed attributes. Today, in our Pricing 101, we'll talk about pricing methodologies for a fixed attribute product, so one that is already well defined, versus a pricing study where you can vary the attributes of your product and test different scenarios, whether it's modifying even brand sensitivity or modifying some of the features of your product. And of course, the end goal is to give you some of the tools so that you can price your product to better meet your business goals. So let's frame our conversation by considering that we're going to talk about just price in terms of the 4 Ps of marketing, right? Product, placement, promotion, and price. And address why or what it is you need to know for pricing and why it's not sufficient to simply ask people, what are you willing to pay for this? And that's some of the challenges of declarative pricing. All of the academic pricing problems in MBA programs and pricing books assume that somehow magically you have obtained some price elasticity data for your market. And that may be possible for a consumer market, but for the healthcare markets where we have a small population and therefore small sample sizes, and the challenge of obtaining this data, you often won't have price elasticity data. And the tools we're going to show you today are either a way around not having that information or a tool to get that information for you. Some of the other problems with declarative pricing are the negotiation bias that people will have if you ask them simply, particularly your customers, if you ask them simply, how much would you pay for this? They get into a sense of initiating a negotiation, and they will tend to report to you a lower price than they would actually be willing to pay. Another big problem is the misalignment of assumptions and expectations that the survey design group yourselves may have relative to your consumer, your customers' expectations and assumptions. And we'll talk about that a little bit and how to address that. And then, of course, there are some challenges that are unique to the healthcare market. In particular, of course, reimbursement. The healthcare market, we're dealing with reimbursements instead of purely price based on value of a product like you have in most consumer markets. So that has to be taken into account. Likewise, what I call the 3 Ps challenge, the fact that the customer is not always who pays. So the person who receives the value of a product, of a healthcare or medical product, is often the patient. But the patient is not necessarily the one who's paying for the product. So even though the end recipient of the value of your offering is the patient, that person is not who's going to be paying for it. In fact, often the person who pays, the payer, the insurance company, and the person who's buying the product, the physician or the hospital, for example, the provider of care, are different from the person who's receiving the value of the product, which is the patient. Now, sometimes the patient isn't receiving the value, for example, some consulting service that's provided to the hospital or an EMR service. The patient doesn't derive as much value, and the hospital actually does. Sometimes you have a good correlation between who's paying and who extracts the value, but often in healthcare you don't, and this creates a challenge, the 3P challenge. Then, of course, there's the challenge that's unique in healthcare in that you have both clinical versus economic drivers. And often the clinical benefits of a product don't tie directly to economic benefits. Economic benefits are easy to quantify, and it's very easy to imagine if you have a quantifiable economic benefit that the willingness to pay should match up with the delivered benefit with some risk discount or so. Whereas the clinical benefits of, say, improving quality of care or patient satisfaction are very difficult to monetize. And so somehow you, as a product manager or as a provider of healthcare services, need to figure out how to extract that value of the clinical benefits and clinical improvements when they're difficult to monetize. So why do we need to engage in pricing studies, and why are they a little bit different for healthcare? Of course, the value of a product is based on the utility that's received by the customer over the price that they're willing to pay. So you need to understand how to capture the value of some of these characteristics unique to the healthcare market, like better clinical outcomes, like increased patient throughput and improved patient satisfaction. Now, as we mentioned, those may be difficult to monetize, but for instance, patient satisfaction, now with HCAHPS scores, patient satisfaction scores, being tied directly to reimbursements, there is some portion of that that can be monetized and measured in economic terms. But better clinical outcomes may or may not be easy to quantify, and it's a matter of understanding customers' response to the value of that and what they're willing to pay for it for their patients. Shorter patient stays. Is there value in that? There are situations where shorter patient stays reduce the hospital cost, so you can make a case that there is some value to that reduced cost of delivering the care. However, you need to contemplate situations like improved or higher reimbursements to hospitals if a patient stays. For example, after some surgical procedures, the hospital submits for reimbursement, and that reimbursement can be increased if the patient needs to stay for 2 days. In fact, it turns out that reimbursement may be higher than the cost to keep the patient in the hospital for an additional day. So it's actually an incentive for the hospital to keep the patient in the hospital for 48 hours, even though their costs go up because the reimbursement is higher than the incremental cost. So be cognizant of the implications that just reducing cost may not be parallel to the hospital's incentive in terms of their margins on a procedure. Alternative treatments may or may not allow alternative or different reimbursements. They may be a lower cost treatment that meets the treatment guidelines of a particular DRG, but there may or may not be reimbursements associated with that. And then different reimbursements, certain procedures or certain diagnostic tests may allow a new or additional reimbursement code to be applied, or if you simplify a test, you may reduce the reimbursement codes that are applicable, so the overall reimbursement to the hospital for that procedure might go down. So who contemplates all of these factors? And it's very important to consider who you're going to field a pricing study to. Now, these pricing studies are typically quantitative in nature. They tend to be surveys, but there is value to qualitative research to inform the study design. And when contemplating who you're going to field the survey to, these are the considerations, or some of the considerations to take into account. You need to have respondents that understand the benefits, the clinical benefits, for example, that understand the value proposition of what you're offering, say a non-invasive test versus what is currently done only in an invasive manner. What's the value of that in the overall cost of care and the quality of care for that patient? You need to talk to respondents who can understand the medical implications, who understand the operational implications. If you have a product that can reduce surgical time by a certain amount, does that mean that now they can turn over ORs a little bit faster and get in an additional procedure per day? And are you talking to someone who understands what the economic implications to the hospital are so that they can extract the value? You need to talk to respondents who know the prices of the products, who know the reimbursements, and preferably, especially for large capital purchases, the respondents need to understand some of the economic calculations like total cost of ownership or net present value. And of course, the challenge, as you know, when you talk to clinicians who may be the champion for your new technology, and they may understand the benefits and they may understand the medical implications, but they may or may not understand operational implications. And as you also know, often clinicians don't know the prices of the products they're using, particularly consumables or IT services, sometimes even implants, high-cost implants. They may not know the reimbursements. They might know the codes, but they might not know what dollar value is associated with those, even if they do know the reimbursement codes. And it's rare that a physician will understand economic models like total cost of ownership and net present value. On the other hand, if you talk to your customers that are maybe purchasing managers or service line managers, they may not fully understand the clinical benefits or the value proposition. They probably don't fully understand the impact of the quality of care, except in general terms. They probably do understand, however, the operational implications, particularly a service line manager or say an OR manager or an imaging director may very well know the implications of easier setup in a radiology center, or the benefits accrued by having faster transmission of higher quality digital images between a referring physician and the hospital or the radiology group, or all three. Often, of course, the purchasing managers will know the prices of products and they'll know reimbursements, and they may or may not understand economic models. So what you find is that in order to get adequate data to make pricing decisions, you may need to query people other than your direct customers, because they'll get involved in that value analysis committee. You may need to query nurses, may need to go to the CFO or CEO, the C-level, particularly for large consulting engagements, services that you offer for consulting, or large system-wide or hospital-wide installations of IT services or other distributed products. You may need to talk to imaging directors or other line managers. The result of this distribution of knowledge in terms of valuing your product is that you need to make sure that your respondents or combination of respondents understand the relevant pricing model for your offering. They need to understand the clinical value, and they need to understand the relevant decision process. In other words, when a decision is made for that type of offering, what are the priorities? Is it quality of care? Is it speed? Is it efficiency? And what is it that the hospital is willing to pay for? Some consumable products, they're focused purely on price. What's the lowest cost we can get for these alcohol swabs? Other products will have some balance of the various attributes, and you need to, the respondents you have need to be able to give you that information so that you can gather what it is that's valuable to them. And of course, the implication for your study design is you need to build in screeners and quotas to talk to the right people that will know this information. So moving on, something that can be easily overlooked is the question of what price are you testing? It's very easy for a price to be tested that can be ambiguous, or you have a different understanding than your customers do. And it's very important that the price you're testing is completely unambiguous to the respondent. So for example, with capital equipment, does the capital equipment price that you're asking your respondents to reply to you on include siting costs? Or is it purely the cost of the capital piece of equipment? Does the price you're asking them about include training? What about the service plan? How much of a service plan? For how long? What's included in it? Is included in the price you're asking them to comment on. Financing options. Do you offer different financing options, and do they have different value to the customers? Consumables. Are consumables included? If so, for how long or to what limit? Updates and upgrades, particularly for equipment with software. Are the updates provided included in the cost? Are upgrades? Those are all important considerations, and you need to make sure that the price you're asking about is very clear in terms of what's included and what is not. Another example for consumables. Purchasing managers may assume that a product you're asking about, which they always buy in boxes of 10, implies 10 units. If you ask for them, how much would you be willing to pay, or how likely would you be willing to pay for say a Foley catheter, they may tell you $25, thinking, well, I always buy these in boxes of 5. $25 is what I've been paying. Even if you have an improved feature, I need to pay what I'm paying now. That's what's in their head. But what you're asking them in the survey might be price per catheter. So some respondents will understand that you're asking price per catheter. Now you get responses that are bimodal, some around $25, some around $5. You may even get some that tell you $200 because they're used to buying them in boxes of 10. So be very clear that the price you're asking for is an individual unit or a box. Is it the unit itself, or is it a kit that includes all the ancillary consumables? Very important. If you get responses that, if you're not clear about this, you may get responses that say, well, I'll pay $8 for that catheter. Others will tell you 18, but they're thinking that 18 includes all the ancillary swabs and alcohol and glove and the like. Are you asking about list price or average selling price? Respondents know that they'll get a discount, maybe through their GPO, on that type of product, typically of 10, 15, 20%, and they'll report to you the discounted price, the ASP. You may be asking for the list price. Be clear which you're asking about. Inventory is another consideration. Who carries that inventory? That may have an impact on the price they're willing to pay. IT and software, some other considerations. What's the scale? When you're asking for a software or IT implementation, what's the scale? Are you asking for the price per unit? So maybe a bedside monitor. There's a price to install this new software system that could be hospital-wide, all the monitors at the hospital? Is it per user or per patient or per use? Very important to distinguish that and recognize that there are scaling factors. If you ask for the price for an IT installation for an institution, you're going to get a very different value for a small institution with 50 beds or a large institution with 400, 450 beds. So you may need to build in some pipe throughs or other programming in your survey so you could actually accommodate if somebody tells you early in the survey, I'm a CIO at a 500-bed hospital, you could actually ask them their willingness to pay price times X number of beds so that a imaging director, say, or an IT director at a smaller hospital might see a lower price, but you've calculated that based on the fact that they only have 48 beds in their hospital. Service and support. Is that included? Do you have some type of a service program? Is that a separate price? Do you want to ask about the price of the installation and a separate series of questions about the service and support? Again, upgrades and updates, are those included? What about installation and who's responsible for the V&V? People generally are willing to pay for that installation and the V&V, but that's a fixed cost rather than a variable cost. Be very clear about that. And then finally, as we mentioned earlier, financing options or your pricing plan. You may have a study that's focused purely on the value of different pricing options like a subscription or a lease or an outright purchase. And that's absolutely acceptable to do that. If you're not testing that, understand that there may be different values to different respondents for a subscription, lease, or purchase plan, and design your survey accordingly. So the bottom line with the price to test is that you must be unambiguous and make sure that you are asking questions that consider your customer's default assumptions. If you're asking about a product that often comes in a box, be very clear that you're asking about the price for a 5-unit box or a 10-unit box or per individual unit. Now, other considerations are tax. In the EU, especially for large capital equipment, prices are often presented with tax included, whereas in the US, tax is not included. So it may be important to specify whether tax is included or not. So contemplate whether your options are purchase price or total cost of ownership, and of course that can be programmed in. And also whether you want to ask about an absolute price or a relative price, which would be, of course, a price premium or a discount relative to some standard that's already known. If you have a new system that can reduce the hospital's or reduces the overall cost of the hospital, maybe you can charge a small premium for that. And you could ask them, how much of a premium would you be willing to pay for this offer compared to what you're paying now? Or you can ask them the actual price. But do consider what your customers will assume. So this again brings up the point that you may need qualitative research, whether that's focus groups or in-depth interviews or dyad, some other discussion, to understand customers' expectations. Not only who makes the buying decisions and what does each person, each title know, but also what price do they generally think about when they look at these different products. Okay. Now, another consideration, in addition to who to talk to and what price to present, is whether to anchor the respondents or not with some known. The price to be tested has to be tested based on the customer's knowledge at the time they make a purchase decision. And what I mean by that is that if there is particularly a large purchase, say a large piece of capital equipment or a big IT installation, most likely the customers will be making a decision, so say a hospital will be making a decision through a value analysis committee or a pricing or purchase committee. And they'll do quite a bit of research before they make their final decision. So it's important to contemplate what they'll know when they're making the decision. And potentially you can consider offering that information in the design of your survey. So an example might be a purchase of capital equipment. Before a capital equipment purchase is decided on, the value analysis committee will go out, and certain people will go out and find out, well, what are the competitive options? How much do they cost? What are the alternatives? What are the service plans? And different roles and responsibilities in the hospital will go out and see what those implications are. The IT director may look particularly at the service maintenance upgrade plans. Someone else may look at competitive hardware offerings. So an example would be to help ground the respondents and anchor them by giving them the knowledge they'll have when they make a decision about your product. So for example, a CT scanner, you could give them the prices of these systems. And again, you've described your offering to them. You can anchor them by saying the competitive offerings, for instance, a 2D C-arm might be 150 to 250,000, whereas a full-size fixed CT scanner might be $750,000 to $2 million. And might remind them that these are prices excluding siting costs and other details that you provided to help ground them and give them an anchor from which to assess your offering. Similarly, for a consumable, one other thing to point out is if you're going to be fielding your study in multiple countries, it's always worthwhile to present prices in the in-country price. And there are two ways to do this. One is to just use a conversion factor based on the exchange rate, the foreign exchange rate, and offer what effectively is the same price but converted using the exchange rate. Another consideration is if prices for certain products are significantly different in one market relative to another, one global market relative to another, because of the nature of that market, then you may want to offer the prices that are relevant in that country. But recognize if you do that and they're not tied to one another by exchange rate, right, they're market unique prices, then you will not be able to compare results of respondents in the US, say, to Great Britain or to European markets that use the euro. Another example would be consumable products where the reimbursement rate might be very important. High volume, relatively low price products. So you may want to consider that when a decision is being made, the CNO or another person in the value analysis committee will have gone out to find out what are the reimbursement rates for these procedures. So an example we give here is a point of care CBC test. For this particular study, we grounded the respondents with the CPT codes and the Medicare fee that's paid so that they could assess, are they willing to pay a little more than their reimbursement rate because this new offering has some unique features, or do they want to stay within that fee? And once they're grounded with these are the reimbursements, they can make a more informed decision and give you better information that better reflects the decision-making process they would make. Now, we had a question about, it says, our salespeople tell us we're too expensive relative to competitors. How can I validate this? And this anchoring can be used to address that by providing the competitive prices. So for example, the CT scanner example, you could give not just price ranges for types of equipment or different form factors. You could provide specific equipment and say the Philips such and such machine list price is this, the Siemens machine is this, the GE machine is this, the Toshiba machine is this, and provide specific products, competitive products that would be competing with yours, and give the prices, because your customers are going to know those. They will investigate that when they make a decision on your product. So anchoring is a good way to get better information in a competitive marketplace. And to address your question, if the salespeople are telling us you're too expensive relative to competitors, a good way to validate that is with a study where you provide the competitors' prices. So providing that anchoring information on competitors' prices would help better mimic the decision process of your customers. So what I'd like to do right now is we've covered some of the basic considerations that you need to take into account when you're designing a study, and that we found are often extremely important, and that suggest if you don't know the answers to these questions, who decides, what do they decide on, how do they think about prices, then it may be important to do a short qualitative research step prior to designing your study. Now, when you start designing your study, there are a few different methodologies that can be used in that quantitative survey, and we're going to cover basic declarative questions, Cascading Price, and Funstendorp in today's Pricing 101. In September, in Pricing 201, we'll focus on a little bit more sophisticated techniques, including choice-based trade-off, conjoint, and ACBC, which is adaptive choice-based conjoint, and build your own, as well as modeling using that data. Now, there's a question that says, what technique gives me price elasticity? And that's a very good question. The techniques we're going to talk about today, Declarative, Cascading Price, and Funstendorp, don't give you price elasticity, except in a very small range. It can give you some sense of elasticity. Or with a modified Westendorp, you can get some sense of purchase likelihood. But really, price elasticity comes in when you use the choice-based conjoint techniques, and we'll cover that in Pricing 201. So declarative price methodologies. A question is, what technique is best for a small budget? So let's cover that. The declarative methods that we're going to talk about today, straight declarative, Cascading Price, and von Westendorp price sensitivity meter, are all very budget sensitive methods. You'll see the first item under benefits here is efficiency. So there are some limitations though, but the declarative methods we'll talk about today tend to be very cost effective. So the disadvantages of these though are that you can only test fixed attribute offerings. So you have to fully describe your product and ask the willingness to pay or likelihood to adopt at a certain price for a very specific product description. You can't do scenario modeling where you modify the competitive set or modify your product with different features. And then there's the challenge of outliers and erroneous responses. If you simply ask people what would you be willing to pay, or a better way to word that would be, how much would you expect to budget for this? Or regardless of whether you're willing to buy this or not, what would be a fair price? So is a better way to word these questions. But regardless, if you ask people to enter a price, there are some problems that are technical problems that someone could mean to enter $120, but instead they miss the decimal point and they enter 12000, which would be $12,000, of course. At the low end of the price range, it's very typical for respondents to make a mistake. $2.73 quickly becomes $27.3, or they enter 273, thinking that the decimal point will magically appear, or sometimes the decimal point does magically appear, but they're not thinking that, and they enter 27. Thinking $2.70, but it turns out to be 0.27. So there are some problems with having people type in a number, both at the low end, but also at the high end. If it's a large, say an MRI, and the respondent wants to give you 1.2 million, they may put 1.2, they may put 1.2 M, they may put 1200000, and may miss the number of zeros. And that becomes very difficult to interpret at the end of your study. So be aware of that, think about it, and make it as clear as possible in the way you design your survey, or skip that and move to a more directed approach like Cascading Price or von Westendorp. The benefits, though, are that it is, as I mentioned, efficient. The results and the survey questions are both easy to understand and straightforward. And it's particularly good for answering specific questions. What is an acceptable price range for my product or my new technology? What is the willingness to pay for some offering within a known range? What is the adoption likelihood at this price? When you have a fixed product, the declarative price methodologies are very good for that. So let's talk first about cascading price. Cascading price technique is best when an approximate price is known and you've already homed in on what is appropriate for this product, whether it's because there are very similar competitive products on the market, or because you've done preliminary research, or because it's tied very closely to a reimbursement. Cascading price is a test of willingness to pay, and it's very good for that. And as I mentioned, it's limited to fixed product configurations. Cascading price is quite straightforward. You determine your price range, and you ask, how likely would your office or clinic or your hospital or you be willing to pay, in this case $400,000, for this system? You've already described it fully. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. Very succinct description of your product that gives all the information necessary, and you've identified what's included in that price. In this case, they've already seen it, but the survey respondents are reminded that it includes the warranty, installation, and training for the first year. They then respond, and those who respond that they are very likely or extremely likely to purchase at $400,000 are done with this task. We like to put numbers in to quantify what somewhat likely and likely are. Those respondents who answer very likely or extremely likely are done. You know they're willing to buy this at $400,000. Those who respond, I'm only somewhat likely, will be asked the same question at $300,000. Let's lower the price. How likely would you be to purchase at a lower price? Same process applies. Those who say, well, I'm only somewhat likely or likely to purchase at $300,000 are asked another question. Those who say, I'm very likely to purchase at $300,000 or extremely likely are done. And then the question is repeated at $200,000 for those that are likely or less to purchase at $300,000. And by now, respondents have learned the game, and you're pretty much done. That's the extent of what you can do. But the results of something like this can be very powerful. You fully described your product, and now you ask people how likely are they to purchase, and now you can get a result like this. So cascading price, when asked extremely or how likely are you to pay $400,000, 9% of the respondents say they're willing to pay at least $400,000. The other 94% are asked the question, well, how willing are you to pay at least $300,000? And an additional 23% report, well, I am willing to pay $300,000. So now nearly a third of your respondents are willing to pay at least $300,000. So that's 300 and above. And then when repeated at $200,000, an additional 17% said, well, if you drop it to $200,000, I am extremely or very likely to pay. And you find out that that about half of your respondents, 49%, are willing to pay at least $200,000. Of course, that includes those who are willing to pay $300,000 or $400,000. Now I have a question here. It says, how do I pick a price range? $200,000 to $400,000 seems really big. Very good question. There are really two ways to do this. You can, of course, there are many ways you can do this. You can do it by gut, and there are many considerations. But the two rules of thumb we suggest are select your target price, maybe your target price plus a small premium, like maybe 10%, as the high point, and go down from there. Or use your expected price, what you expect will be your ASP, as a midpoint, and then ask plus and minus 15%. And from this, then, you can get a good sense for not just willingness to pay, but from this you can extrapolate potential market share, because you can see what percentage of your respondents are willing to pay this much. Plus, if you've asked the appropriate demographic questions, right? What type of hospital are they in? What type of market are they in? How much competition is there? Who the respondent is? Is it an imaging director? Is it a chief nursing officer, a CEO, a radiologist, the surgeon? You can also segment those out and see how the willingness to pay differs by the particular customer. So cascading price can be very valuable and very useful once you have all this data. Now, Let's talk about von Westendorp. Peter von Westendorp was a Dutch economist and designed his price sensitivity meter in 1976. It's been used for a long time. It's very powerful for determining an acceptable price range in a market where the customers already have a good general sense of what's available and what are appropriate prices. It tests customer knowledge of reasonable price levels and where your product fits in. Again, it's limited to fixed product configurations, so you can't modify your product. You have to ask about a specific product. And the questions in a classic von Westendorp are, at what price does this product or service become so expensive that you wouldn't even consider it? When is it so cheap that you'd question its quality? You just don't believe that it can deliver on the promise. When is it starting to get expensive, but still worth considering? And when is it a bargain? Once those 4 questions are asked, the respondents in terms of the cumulative percent can be charted. One curve for the bargain or inexpensive price, one curve for the expensive price. And looking back at the bargain curve, I should point out the way to read this is that at a price below about $20, 100% of respondents say that's a bargain. Once you get up to $100, only about 20% report that $100 is a bargain price. So taking those 4 questions, the curve for expensive, the curve for too expensive, and the cumulative curve for too cheap. Looking at the various intersections, there are 2 of particular interest, and of course there's a lot more to this, but the 2 that are of particular interest are the PMC, the point of marginal cheapness, and the PME, the point of marginal expensiveness. The PMC are where the too cheap and the expensive curves cross. Point of marginal expensiveness are where the bargain or inexpensive curve crosses the too expensive curve. The price points at the PMC and the PME define the acceptable price range for your offering. Now, someone sent a question saying, what do you mean by too cheap on the prior slide? This is the concept that at some point there is a perception that a product is priced so low that it can't possibly deliver on the promise. If someone offered you a brand new car for $5,000, which seems like a lot of money, but you know that most cars cost significantly more than that, one would question the quality, durability, and safety of that vehicle. I think we all know a few vehicles that I might be referring to. So that's what meant by too cheap, and that can be phrased in a survey appropriately and defined. Certainly it's easier to explain in a qualitative setting where they have the opportunity to discuss with the respondents. And during those discussions, you can often get very good other related information in terms of how the respondents perceive the price of the product. Now, von Westendorp, as I mentioned, is fixed product configurations only. It's very good for determining acceptable price range. What von Westendorp does not do is it doesn't indicate purchase likelihood. It just tells what people think is an acceptable price. I may report that $120,000 is an acceptable price for a Ferrari, but I will never be buying a Ferrari. The likelihood of me purchasing it is basically 0. I've got 2 kids after all. So you have to understand what von Westendorp means, what it gives you, and what it doesn't give you. Now, we have a product called von Westendorp Pro, which by modifying von Westendorp basic price sensitivity meter with a few additional questions can capture purchase likelihood. So von Westendorp Pro is just an enhancement to basic von Westendorp Pro, and you ask 2 additional questions. If your offering was offered at the bargain price, how likely would you, your practice, your hospital be to purchase it? You ask that question also for the expensive price. If this offering was offered at the expensive price, how likely would you be to purchase it? And then some likelihood scale. And now what you can do is you can use something like what we call von Westendorp Pro, and you can start to play with this. And this is what it would look like. So this is the basic von Westendorp curve. And you see here your point of marginal cheapness of around $600, where these lines intersect. You see the point of marginal expensiveness of around $1,000, where these 2 lines intersect. That's basic von Westendorp. And by the way, when you have this data, as I mentioned, you can segment out your respondents. So this is the result with all segments. You see here on the left the point of marginal cheapness, point of marginal expensiveness, and this can be done on Excel. You can segment out the non-users of a particular technology and see that the price range goes to 700 to 1,000. But if you look at the users, which the term we used for users of a particular technology, their price drops from 500 to 800. And those are the users of a competing technology. So those who aren't using the competing technology feel that an acceptable price range is higher, 700 to 1,000. So that's how you can use the basic von Westendorp to give you some useful information. But by adding the two questions about likelihood to pay, you can also develop a curve that shows purchase likelihood and revenue likelihood based on that purchase likelihood. And now you're getting into price elasticity impacts. So you see at the purchase likelihood, the highest purchase likelihood is around $750 for all segments. And the revenue maximized a little bit higher. And that has to do with elasticity, right? Larger margin, but slightly fewer units. And you can always summarize that. Point of marginal cheapness, point of marginal expensiveness, so the acceptable price range is between 600 to 1,000. And the maximum likelihood to purchase is at $750 with about 36% reporting likely to buy and your maximum revenue. So this addition to von Westendorp makes it a very powerful tool that not only do you get the acceptable price range, but you can get some sense of the price elasticity and purchase likelihood. So I want to show you that tool. A simple addition to von Westendorp could be very powerful for you. So to summarize, set your objectives when you're doing a pricing study. Do you need a price range or do you need a willingness to pay or validation of a willingness to pay? And from that, you can determine the appropriate methodology. Make sure you select your respondents. We talked about the respondents, and then build your quotas and your screener in your survey design appropriately to select the right combination of respondents that can address the clinical benefits, the operational benefits, that know price and have a grounding on the price. Choose whether to anchor and fully describe your price after you've selected your methodology. Now, your methodology is based on your objectives, right? For price sensitivity or trade-off analysis, you may need a more sophisticated technique, which we'll cover in Pricing 201. And price, again, just to reiterate, define your price specifically for the price you want to test, so it's unambiguous. Then design your survey, field it, do the QC on your respondents, and then, of course, interpret correctly. The data you got, is it giving you an acceptable range? Or is it giving you willingness to pay or adoption likelihood? Now, session 2, as I mentioned, is going to cover a little bit more sophisticated choice-based conjoint modeling, build your own and adaptive CBC, as well as preference modeling for price sensitivity to get more refinement on price sensitivity, and market calibrated modeling for price and profit. This is on Thursday, September 10th. And it'll be at the same time as this webinar. Well, that wraps up session 1 of your overview of pricing research tools for medical technology. After the webinar, take a moment, if you would, to provide us your feedback, also about other topics you'd like to see us cover. We really appreciate your joining us. On behalf of the MarkeTech Group, thank you everyone for your time. If you have further questions about pricing research, or if you have a question about designing a study, we're happy to help you. We're here to answer your questions. It's what the MarkeTech Group does. So please contact TMTG to be your marketing research partner. Good day, everyone.